This Talend Data Mapper
We're going to have
tutorial
a look at
covers
EDI,
EDI.
and
Talend
this
Data Mapper
tutorial will be
supports
useful for
X12
those
and
of you who
Edifact EDI.
really haven't had any exposure to EDI to get some idea of what EDI looks like and how you work with it. So we do provide an EDI examples project, and these aren't the greatest examples, but uh, they can illustrate some facts about EDI. So we'll have a look at a map here that deals with mapping a purchase order to an invoice. So EDI comes in two basic categories, X12, which is United States, and Edifact, which is the rest of the world. So here we're only going to be looking at X12 transactions. X12 EDI transactions are identified by a three-character number, three-digit number. So in this case, we have the 850, which is a purchase order, and an 810, which is the invoice. X12 transactions have envelope segments. So the way EDI works is, if we look at the structure definition here, and we look at a document, is an EDI message is composed of segments and elements, essentially. So they're delimited by, each segment is terminated by a segment terminator. In this case, it's a new line. Typically, it's a tilde, and each element is terminated by an element terminator, which in this case is a star. And so the segment, here you see the segments in the message definition, ISA, GSST, BEG, and so forth. And you see the segments in the message. So the first 2 to 3 characters of the segment are the name of the segment, and then followed by the element delimiter. And then from there are all the elements. You're not allowed to use the element delimiter or segment delimiter in the data of the message so that it doesn't get confused. So the EDI definitions that we provide have all of the documentation that's applicable. So if you look at in the structure editor, you see the purpose, and there's a lot of narrative about how these are used, and sometimes they provide examples. So there's a lot of description about what's going on. In addition, we provide all the code values. So here, for example, the ISA01 has a number of different code values, and we provide the definitions for all of those. So that's the structure of a basic an EDI message. EDI messages are wrapped in envelopes. There's essentially 3 levels of enveloping. One is the interchange. An interchange can consist of a bunch of functional groups. So interchanges are started by the ISA, and they are ended by the IEA segment. And you see that the IEA segment will have the number of included functional groups in the interchange control number. The interchange control number is something that is unique across all interchanges between 2 trading partners. And that's specified in the interchange header. There's the interchange control number in this case. So an interchange is something that's actually more or less a physical message. So when you send a message on a VAN, a value-added network, which is one of the ways that you can send EDI, AS2 is another way you can send EDI, then you send an entire interchange. Within the interchange, there may be 1 or more functional groups. They're designated by the GS and GE segments. And again, we see in the trailer, there's an identifier of the functional group, the control number, which is unique within the interchange, and then the number of sets included. And then finally, within each functional group, there's a transaction, and there may be any number of transactions. So we see the transaction set identifier code. In this case, it's an 850, because that's what we're working with here. And there's a control number, which is unique within the functional group. And the end of the transaction set is marked by the SE, which has the number of included segments and the control number. So then, for each transaction, the segments are pretty much specific to that transaction. So an 850 will have, we'll start off with a BEG segment. And you'll notice here that's a mandatory segment, so every 850 will always start with that. Many of the segments in EDI are optional. In fact, most of them are. So EDI has an enormous number of segments and elements that describe all manner of business transactions, and most people use only a very small subset of them. So this BEG segment has the purpose code, for example, which is an original purchase order, it looks like, purchase order number, and so forth. So then segments may loop. So here, for example, is a ref segment. A ref is a generic segment which provides some kind of reference information, and this qualifier is what tells it the kind of reference information. You can see there's a tremendous number of qualifiers. One of the things that you can do at any level in a tree that's shown in a map or a structure, if you simply type something into it, so say we're looking for something to do with banking, if we type in these letters, then what it will do is it will filter the code values. So now we're only seeing the code values that are related to banking. And then if you hit escape, it will, or backspace, it will remove the characters, and then escape will also remove all of them. So segments can loop, and here is indicated by this is an unbounded loop. And then you can further have something called a loop in EDI, which is a loop of a collection of segments. So for example, here is a loop beginning with the SAC segment. So this loop it always has to start with an SAC segment, which is mandatory. It says it's optional here, but since it begins a loop, it's required to indicate the beginning of the loop. The segment itself and the loop itself is optional. And then it can have any number of segments after that. So that's a different type of loop, and that's used often in EDI transactions. So for example, the PO1 loop contains the item data, and then if you look, you can see each item here. There happens to only be one item in this segment, in this element. So this is just shows you a little bit about how EDI is structured and how we represent it in our definitions. So now I want to show a little bit more about a more real example. This what I'm showing here is not the typical way we will be packaging EDI. We normally package EDI by having a structure that only has the transaction set, and then we have the envelope packages structures differently. So to illustrate that, we'll look at the healthcare EDI. So one of the types of EDI that's currently in use is healthcare EDI, and that's a special kind of EDI, X12 EDI, that has been heavily extended to deal with healthcare and is mandated by the United States law for HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability Act. So here we're going to look at, and these transactions are normally pretty large and complex EDI transactions. So here we're going to look at a 271, which is a healthcare benefit eligibility request. Now notice this looks a little bit different than what I showed you before. We still have the ISA and the GS segments, but they're arranged in a different hierarchy because they're actually in a real interchange. They would be in loops, and the example I showed before did not have those in loops. So that was sort of a bit of a contrived example. This is the way you'll really see them used. That you'll have a loop for ISA, a loop for GS, and a loop for the STs, and then you'll have the transaction set, which includes the actual ST segment and all the enclosing segments. This transaction is a little bit special in that it includes something that you'll see in certain EDI transactions called an HL loop, and it stands for hierarchical level. So if we look at the data here, here's an HL segment which contains then an NM1 segment. So if we look here under information source, we see loop HL, and we see the HL segment here. Then we look down another level of the hierarchy, we see loop HL, another segment here. So this transaction, the HL segments are a generic way to represent hierarchical data. And of course, EDI doesn't have any hierarchy in it. It's flat. So it represents it by these level numbers. So this is the top level, and then this second HL line 7 here is nested within the top level and refers back to the top level. So if we look at there's the ID number, and then there's the level code. 20 is the top level in this document. There's the top level, and 21 is a level code here, and it shows its parent ID number. So it says this HL at line 7 belongs within the HL at line 5. And then down here at line 10, HL number 3 belongs within the HL here. It's at line 7 and is level code 22. And if we look further in the document under subscriber, we see this definition here. And we note that subscriber is actually a loop. So the way this transaction is defined is it's defined a single HL segment for the source, which is ABC Company, another HL instance for the receiver, which is the Bone and Joint Clinic, and then a loop of HL segments for the subscribers, which are in this case there's only one, Robert Smith, and then within that loop another loop of segments for the dependents of the subscriber, which Mary Lou Smith is one, and there may only be one. Yeah, it looks like there's only one. So, and you'll notice that with the definition of these HL segments, you'll notice these non-visible elements. Element tags don't appear in the document. So TDM allows the specification of non-visible elements for grouping purposes. And what was done to create this structure is a template was applied to this structure which organized the HL loops into these levels so that the structure actually appears as a hierarchy when you're mapping it. Because typically what you'd want to do is you would want to map this structure into something that's hierarchical. And if we look at the map here, we see that we're mapping to a simple XML structure, and we see that it is in fact hierarchical. So we have a sender, a receiver, a subscriber, and dependents, and they're arranged in a hierarchy. And since we provide, if we go down to the subscriber here and look at the ID number, we double click on the line and will bring us to where we are, to that place in the map. Since we express this in a hierarchy in the map, it's very easy then to make the looping work to map from this input EDI that has these sort of flat levels arranged in a hierarchy into the actual hierarchy. And if you look at the looping instructions here that are actually given, you'll see that it uses a loop, but then it uses this filter, for example, to look at the values of 22, because it's only looking for the 22 entries in the loop type. And if you look at the dependent loop, it's much more complicated because it has to go and say, okay, we'll look under the 22 level of the parent and then look for everything up until we find the next level of looping. Now, to create this looping expression is very complex. And what we do with this template mechanism is we actually provide the looping expression in the input structure here, so that here is the actual loop expression that will be used by any output that is referencing this. So when you first map, we'll just remove the mapping here to just show you how it works. When we first map something, like the subscriber last name, what it will do is it will copy this looping expression here over into the looping expression for the output. So you as a user don't need to worry about the complexity of the looping expression. It just does the right thing for you. And so then if we map something inside the dependent loop, it does the same thing. So essentially what we're doing is we're hiding the complexity. See here, and the dependent loop gets this complex loop expression that is set up here. So we provide a nice way of referencing this HL data in a hierarchy and making sure the looping is very simple. There's no other product that does anything like this as far as EDI support for these HL loops. And the HL loops you see in a lot of transactions. Several healthcare transactions have them. And one of the important business transactions, the 856, which is an advanced ship notice, used a lot in supply chain, has them as well. So it's kind of an important feature. So that's a little bit about what the data looks like, what the envelope looks like, how you can work with the data, segments and elements. And let's look, just before we stop, look at the packaging of the EDI. So what we do is we package the standard definitions into read-only projects. They're actually installed through the installer. So if we look at what we have installed, we can see that we have installed, in fact, the X125010 HIPAA project. So you get the standards of EDI or many other types of standards using the software update mechanism. They're actually built into the project, which is why we make a copy of them if we want to modify them in any way, because they're read-only and they can't be modified. So, and typically, for example, with the EDI projects, we provide the standards and then we provide another project, which is the example project. We also provide help when you install these standards. You also get help. You get a separate book that describes the standards. It's not a huge amount of information, but it tells you basically how to use them. We'll see in a second as soon as help comes up here. So here is the X12 specifications book, and talks about how you use them and how they're packaged. So if we go back and look at what's in the standard definition, it consists only of structures. So the transaction structures define the individual transactions, starting with the ST and the SE. And then in the system area, under envelopes, it defines the interchange. So the interchange consists of the just the envelope segments. So when you want to actually use EDI, or any standard, but in this case EDI, then you will create a custom structure, and we'll just go through doing that. And you create a custom structure by means of inheritance. So okay, we're going to create a custom structure. So let me say new structure, create a structure we're going to customize from another structure, and we want to customize from, in the transactions, we want to pick the structure that has the 270, which has the HL definitions. This 270v1 does not have any HL definitions. It's just stock what's provided for those who don't want to use that feature. Here's and this is only the transaction set without any envelopes. This is the transaction set without any envelopes, but with the HL extensions that we add. And here's the transaction set with all the envelopes. So that's the one we want to customize. And now we have the structure that's in our particular project that we're using, and it has all of the definitions we need. So this is the structure that then can be used as the input or the output of the map that you're going to work with. Finally, I'll show you a couple of other things. When you're using EDI for output, so here we'll look at this map that as a coverage request, which is EDI output. And we'll notice that some of the things in the output are mapped, but some of them actually in this example everything is mapped here. But yes, so for example, the IEA1 is not mapped, which is the number of included transaction sets. These counts of the transaction sets are automatically calculated if they're not mapped. So the EDI parts of TDM understand how to they will figure out the number of segments and transaction sets, so you don't have to worry about doing that. And there's also support. It's not shown in here for calculating control numbers as well. There's some, you can actually use a variable and do arithmetic to map those. And the last little bit I'll show you is the EDI representation properties. So if we look at an EDI structure, we see representations. Any structure can be represented as XML, so there's often an XML representation included if you want to view the data as if it were XML. If we look at the EDI representation by double-clicking on the representation, then we can see EDI type. There's different ways you would name your EDI element conventions depending on the Edifact does it one way normally, and X12 does the other way, so we're picking the X12 way. And there's also some indications that some things that help the importer. You can import EDI definitions from a specification called Guideline XML, which was created by a company called Edifex, which has a product called Spec Builder. And Spec Builder is one of the most popular products for maintaining EDI definitions. So if you have a customer that uses Spec Builder and they create EDI definitions, then you can import those definitions using Guideline XML into TDM. And then here is where you specify the segment element delimiters and other characters as required. This specification is used only for the EDI that you're outputting. The EDI that's input, these characters are automatically detected because they're provided in the document itself. That concludes the EDI tutorial. So hopefully you've seen a little bit about what EDI looks like and understand a little bit about EDI enveloping. You understand some EDI transactions, what the data looks like. I've looked at the special support for the hierarchical level segments used in many of the X12 transactions. Edifact transactions look substantially similar. In fact, actually I'll just show one so you can get an idea of it. So here is an Edifact transaction called a PryCat. Edifact transactions are named in generally 6-character names, and you see the envelopes segments here, UNB, UNG, and UNH. They correspond exactly to the ISA, GS, and ST of X12. The interchange, the functional group, and the message header. The message is the same as a transaction. And then they have the same kind of looping segments. They have the same kind of, here we'll actually look at the data here. They have the same kind of, the segments are structured the same way, where you have a 3-character segment code and then you have element delimiters. They make heavy use of something called composites, which is a grouping of elements, which has another kind of, in this case, a colon separator separates the elements within the composites. In this case, the segment terminator is a single quote. The element terminator is a plus sign, and within an element you could have an element can be a composite and it can have sub-elements in it, and they're separated by colons. So it's basically very, very similar to X12 EDI. The way, the philosophy of how they organize the segments and what the segments means in Edifact tends to be a bit more orthogonal than X12. So they have sort of fewer segments and use them more generally, where X12 has more business purpose specific segments. But beyond that, they're quite similar. So that concludes the EDI tutorial.